Okay, so we got 30 minutes of class left, and so we're not going to get everything done. We'll break this up into another part. But what I wanted to do today is actually twofold. We are going to not only work with Joy a little bit on our retro Amazon, right? We're gonna validate data using Joy. We're also gonna write our first middleware function. And middleware functions, we haven't written them before, and so they're pretty interesting and not the easiest thing the first time through. So this will be, I'll do my best to explain my comprehension of it, and hopefully it makes some sense to you guys by the end of this 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and boot this up. And so we're going to write a middleware function that can take a schema and validate that schema. Okay, so we have to write this function kind of generically enough that it can take in different kinds of schemas and validate those schemas and basically return, yay, that's good data, or no, that's not good data. But the thing that's a little bit different about middleware functions, and I'm going to use a term here, I think the term is correct, they're called, middleware functions are often called factory functions. Have you heard this term before, factory function? Right, well, what does a factory do? A factory builds things. And so a factory function is a function that builds functions. It's weird, right? A factory function is a function that builds other functions. And so, you know, that's kind of weird. And so I kind of Googled this, and we're getting Google's AI assistant called Bard, right? So you might be familiar with ChatGPT. Not sure if you're familiar with Bard. You know, but it's like, hey, why do middleware functions return a function, right? You're writing a function that builds and returns a function, right? And it says express middleware functions return a function because they are designed to be used in a chain. When an express application receives a request, the middleware functions are executed in order in which they are registered. The last middleware function in the chain typically is responsible for sending a response to the client. And so, you know, just to say this, just all to say this, we're going to build our own middleware function. That middleware function returns a function, right? It's a factory function that returns a function because middleware functions are built and such to be used in a chain, one calling after the other, and the last middleware function ultimately sends that back to a client. Okay, all that just to say it's going to be a little bit different. So let's go ahead and create a new folder here. Not inside of public. Do not create your new folder inside of public. Okay, if you kind of click here in the folder root and you click new folder here, let's say middle, M-I-D-D-L-E, where. So we have a new icon here for middleware. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a JavaScript file called validbody.js. Okay, so I don't want anything with Copilot here. So I'm going to make a function, const validBody equals the input is a schema. Okay, so we're going to accept a schema. Okay, so this is a very standard JavaScript function, right? Nothing advanced, nothing different yet. The function is called validBody. Actually, this is a variable that stores an anonymous function. Now, this function called validBody is going to return a function, right? Remember, it's a factory function. This function is going to return a function, rec, res, and next. So this function is an anonymous function that takes our very standard objects. Remember that middleware often can work with the request object and modify request and modify response. That is a very common thing that middleware functions do, is they can modify rec and res. Okay, so this function returns an anonymous function. And inside of here, inside of this function, we're going to declare our variable. And this is going to look similar to what that lecture we just watched. Okay, we're going to make a variable called validation result equals schema.validate. Now our object that we're validating is coming from the request.body, right? Which request.body, we know we can send that across via Postman, right? We know that that is an object with the properties that we send. And like I demonstrated in the video, we also want abort early to false, and that will kind of give us multiple error messages if there are multiple error messages coming from Joy. Which, by the way, haven't even installed Joy yet, but we will. So now that we've run this validate method, we can say, hey, if the validation result has an error, if the validation result has an error kind of object, we're going to send a response of a string res status 400 JSON little error message validation result dot error. And end the curly and the parentheses semicolon. Okay, so here we're running a validate method, and if there's an error, kind of send that error back, res JSON, and send the error back. Otherwise, rec.body equals, now here we're modifying our request object, validation result dot value. And so the value is the object that we were just looking at in that video. Remember, validation results has an object. In other words, like, just keep the rec body equal to the good data. Like, this is good data, this is bad data, simply said. And if the data is good data, we need to call next. Again, that's how you call the next middleware function, is by calling the next function, which you pass in here. And we could add in these optional semicolons right here, and now we're going to export this function. Export valid body. Again, I think writing your first middleware function for the first time can be a bit cryptic. We're not used to writing functions like this. But this is going to allow us to kind of write a schema for our data and call a middleware function. So let's do that, right? So I'll let you guys kind of type that up for another. We all good? I do notice that I have not installed Joy, so let's terminate our server, clear the screen, npm i-joi, npm install Joy. So let's add that dependency. And if I go to my package JSON, I now see Joy as a dependency, and that's what I would expect. Now let's go to my user routes. And let's make our new user schema. Okay, so here's our add route for adding a new user. We are using bcrypt here. And so let's go ahead and define our schema, right? We call this step one. Step one, define new user schema. And so we're going to create a variable called new user schema, which is a Joy object. Again, we looked at this in that last lecture. And what are we expecting here? Well, I believe we have a full name and an email and a password. And do we have a role? I don't think we have a role. Let's look at what's expected. I think we automatically assigned a role as customer, but we didn't expect the role coming from the front end, right? So when I look at what we sent from the client, we have full name, email, and password. So let's do full name is a Joy string. Let's trim. Good idea. Minimum 1 character. Maybe set a max, I don't know, 50. And required. There was also a password field, which is a Joy string. Sure, let's trim it, make sure there's no white space. I don't know, 5 characters password? How strict do you want to be? PASSW0RD. I'll say minimum of 8 because even in my max of 50 required. And what's the last thing? Email? Email. Joy.string.trim email required. Okay. So getting used to Joy is just getting used to the built-in functions. And again, the benefit here is we're not having to write 15 if statements to handle all these cases. We could just call these built-in functions built into Joy library, and voila. Now we wrote a function inside of our middleware folder called valid body. So let's go ahead and import that. So let's go to the top and let's import valid body from, and does that path look good? So we go up 2 directories, go up to API, go up to routes, then go down to middleware, valid body.js. That route looks good to me. So we're bringing in this middleware function called valid body. And now we get to call this function, passing it our schema. Okay, well, how do we call middleware functions? So far, we have not called any custom middleware functions. Just as a reminder, we've called middleware functions and we've installed these as global. And so anytime you see app.use, app.use on your server.js is installing global middleware functions. Okay, but you can also have route-specific middleware functions. And so app.use are global middleware functions. And so when we do app.use this, app.use that, you know, these are global middlewares. Okay, you can also have route-specific middlewares functions. And so to do that right here, here's our route. So we're gonna call valid body before this function executes. Okay, so this is an anonymous function that runs when you call add. To call it before this function, you just put it right here, valid body, and here, and then put a comma. So this is calling our custom middleware function called valid body, but we need to pass it our schema. Our schema is called new user schema. So we wrote the schema here. We call our middleware function that passes it the new user schema. Inside of our middleware, we run the validate function, and if it's bad, we send a response immediately back to the client. But if it's good, we accept the good data and we say go to the next. And so now we've written a schema. We are getting the data. The data is ultimately coming from rec.body, right? You're able to get the data from rec.body, which is where we've been getting our data before. And let's boot this up. npm run start dev. And I did not import Joy. Good eye. So let's do that. Import Joy from Joy. Import Joy from Joy. And now my server is booting. And let's go to add user and just leave off a full name. Now this is port 3003. Let's go back, make sure I'm booted on port 3003. Looking good. If I leave that off, now we're getting back a Joy error message that says full name is required. Right? This is the error message that I would expect. If I put in full name but I forget my email, right? This should be formatted as an email. We're getting email must be a valid email, right? If I give a password that is too short, we're saying password length must be 8 characters long. Okay, how you handle these error messages are up to you, but this is Joy working as it should, and we get the additional benefit of writing it in such a way that's reusable, right? We kind of wrote this valid body. So now to validate a login credentials, well, we just needed to find a new schema, and we need to pass that to valid body. So let's do that. Let's just do one more before this class is over. Const login user schema. That's looking good. Obviously, what we need for a login user is an email and a password. So we already have email and password. Actually, we already have email and password. Literally can copy and paste. If these are good, right? Now how we validate the data, I mean, that's kind of up to us, right, to decide. But now we've got login user schema. And if I go down to my login route, let's call valid body, pass in login user schema, put a comma after it. I don't like that I'm getting different color coding here. Login user schema. Now we're talking. And if I go over to my login user, maybe I don't send over the password. Haha, password is required. If I don't send the email, email is required. If I don't have all the conventions of a password, not a valid email. And if I send a bad one, we get, this is not our Joy validation. This is just our database handling the invalid login correctly. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna let you guys type whatever you guys need to kind of catch up. But now we've done Joy validation on users. Of course, what's left is Joy validation on a few other things. Okay, but this is a good stopping point for today.